In Bible times, when something traumatic happened, the death of a loved one, or bad news or impending judgment, it was traditional to tear your clothes in grief and put on sackcloth and pour ashes on yourself and walk around mourning and grieving. In Genesis 37, when Jacob heard the fake news that his son Joseph has been torn to pieces by a lion, he tore his clothes in grief and mourned outwardly and publicly. In Joshua chapter 7, verse 6, after thousands of Israelites were killed in battle at Ai when they were trying to take over the promised land, Joshua tore his clothing in grief. In Judges chapter 11, verse 35, when Jephthah realized that his daughter was the first one to come out of his house, and that if he had to keep his promise, he had to put her to death, even though he didn't have to. He thought he had to, but he tore his clothing in grief. And people tore their clothes in grief when they saw the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Read about that in the beginning of the book of Lamentations. And here in 2 Samuel 1, we see that it is often true that there is a time to mourn. There's a time to grieve. And at the beginning of the book, David is going to grieve the death of King Saul. The narrator of 1st and 2nd Samuel goes to great lengths and great pains to let us know that David had no part in the destruction of King Saul's dynasty, that he didn't lift a finger against the Lord the King. All he ever did was cut off a little piece of his robe, and that was it. So the narrator is definitely trying to exonerate David from any fake or false charges about that he rose to the kingdom because God had him there. But it doesn't make David a flat character either. We've seen David's faults and foibles and flaws in this book. We saw it in 1 Samuel 27 when he faked insanity so he can hide out among the Philistines and convince the king of the Philistines that he was not a threat. He lied to him about who he and his men were attacking when he wasn't there. In 2 Samuel 11, the David and Bathsheba episode. And so David is not a fictional, made-up, flat character. He's a complex character. But one of the main themes here is that David in no way was an opportunistic person trying to forge his way into the kingdom. 2 Samuel follows the same themes as 1 Samuel. We see the rising up of people who honor God as holy, and we see the dramatic fall of people who reject the holiness of God. 2 Samuel chapter 1. After the death of King Saul, David returned from striking down the Amalekites and staying in Ziklag 2 days. That's still Philistine territory. On the 3rd day, a man arrived from Saul's camp with his clothing torn and dust on his head. And David already knows this is going to be bad news because he's wearing the clothing of mourning. When he came to David, he fell to the ground to pay him honor. "Where have you come from?" David said. He answered, "I've escaped from the Israelite camp." "What happened?" David asked. "Tell me." David knows that the Philistines and Israelites are at war, and he's very concerned about the outcome of the battle. "The men fled from the battle," he replied. "Many of them fell and died, and Saul and his son Jonathan are dead." Verse 5, David said to the young man who brought him the report, "How do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead?" You can almost feel the blood pulsing through David's body, the shock, the disbelief. How do you know they're dead? Verse 6, "I happened to be on Mount Gilboa." That's the camp of the Israelites that got overrun by the Philistines in 1 Samuel 31. "There was Saul leaning on his spear, with the chariots and their drivers in hot pursuit. When he turned around and saw me, he called out to me, and I said, "What can I do?" He asked me, "Who are you?" Yeah, now why would a dying man ask, "Hey, who are you?" And he said, "An Amalekite," I answered. Then he said to me, "Stand here by me and kill me." Really? I'm in the throes of death, but I'm still alive. Now, this is a contradiction from the report we got yesterday, where 3 times it says in 1 Samuel 31 that Saul was dead. So this Amalekite, I question his testimony. I'm thinking he's lying like a rug. He was an opportunist. He was the very person David wasn't. He took advantage of the situation. He took the king's crown and royal garments and brought them to David, thinking he can curry and court favor with David, who's going to be the next king. That's what this is about. I strongly suspect that. Verse 10, so I stood beside him and killed him. Well, by admitting to David that you did what David refused to do, he's signing his own death warrant. So I stood beside him and killed him, because I knew that after he had fallen, he could not survive. And I took the crown that was on his head and the band on his arm, and have brought them here to my Lord. And you could almost picture him with a smile on his face. Look what I've done. This is what you've always wanted, isn't it? You're going to be the king now. But David reacts completely different, because there's a time to mourn. And David knows that Saul, for all of his faults and foibles and flaws, he's the anointed of the Lord. And you don't lift your hand against the Lord's anointed. So David and all the men with him took hold of their clothing and tore them. Not everybody is going to react emotionally to traumatic or tragic news, but it's entirely appropriate to express the grief of the moment. And so they took hold of their clothes and tore them. They mourned and wept and fasted till evening for Saul and his son Jonathan, and for the army of the Lord, and for the nation of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. There's a couple comments that I wanted to make. The guy who says he killed Saul, although I question his testimony because it's got contradictions, he's an Amalekite. Now, what do we know about the Amalekites? I got some notes here from David Guzik's commentary, but one thing they tend to do is they prey on the weak. They cut off the people lagging behind in the wilderness. Though the Bible does not specifically say so, Amalek is commonly regarded as an illustration of our fleshly carnal nature. Like our sinful nature, Amalek attacks the tired and the weak. Deuteronomy 25, 17 and 18. Like our fleshly nature, Amalek does not fear God. Deuteronomy 25, 17 and 18. Like our fleshly nature, God commanded a permanent state of war against Amalek. Exodus 17, 16. Like our sinful nature, the battle against Amalek is won only in the context of prayer. Remember in Exodus 17, as long as Moses had his hands up in prayer, the Israelites were winning against the Amalekites. When he put them down, they were losing. Same thing with our battle against the sinful nature. It's won through continuous prayer. Like our sinful nature, God promised to one day completely blot out the memory of Amalek. Exodus 17:14. Like our sinful nature, Joshua, and Jesus is the new Joshua. That's what the name means in Hebrew, Yeshua. He wins the battle against Amalek. Like our fleshly nature, Amalek was once first, but will one day be last. Numbers 24, verse 20. And like our sinful nature, Amalek allies itself with other enemies in its battle against God's people. And so how ironic that Saul's failure to do away with the Amalekites in 1 Samuel 15 comes back to bite him, because allegedly it's an Amalekite who kills him, although what we know for sure is that it was an Amalekite who took his crown and his armband and brought that to David. We need to deal with the things that come against us early as possible before we have to deal with them when they are more formidable later on. I remember years ago, Ken Norton was watching a young Larry Holmes win a boxing match, and the announcer said to Ken Norton, "How do you think you would do against Larry Holmes?" And Ken Norton said, "Well, let me just tell you this. I'd rather fight him now than later." In other words, he knew that Larry was only going to get better, and he'd rather fight him now before he got better. Well, he fought him 3 years later, and Larry won, so that was almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. So we need to deal with the Amalekites in our lives. We need to not allow them to take authority over us, or they will come back to bite us. So in the Bible, the Amalekites are figurative and analogous to enemies of our soul, sinful desires. So David and his men mourn. Another thing I wanted to point out is not only that the Amalekites are figurative and symbolic for our spiritual enemies, but David had an opportunity to celebrate and gloat over the death of Saul, and he chose not to do it. He had every reason to be bitter. He could have said, "You know what? This guy has been trying to kill me for years, and now God has given him what he deserves. Praise the Lord and amen." And David doesn't do that. He does the exact opposite of what we think he would do. He mourns. He tears his clothes. He grieves. And I don't think he's just putting on a PDA, a public display of affection. He recognizes that King Saul was the anointed of the Lord. And also his son Jonathan, David's dearest and closest friend. How could he not mourn the death of his friend? And you know what this proves? It proves that it's not an automatic guarantee that you have to go through life bitter. David chose to allow his circumstances to make him better rather than bitter. He went to God rather than went to pieces. And that's what we need to do when we're going through hard times. We don't have to simply resign ourselves to the fact that we're going to be sad and sorrowful and filled with rage forever. We can take that stuff to God. We can find strength in God like David did in 1 Samuel 30, verse 6. So David mourns and weeps and fasts until evening for Saul and Jonathan and the army of the Lord. Then verse 13, "Where are you from?" The guy says, "I am a son of a foreigner, an Amalekite," he answered. Verse 14, David asked him, "Why weren't you afraid to lift your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed?" Now the fear of God rushes into the heart of the Amalekite. He thought this was an opportunity for him to be rewarded and compensated for bringing David Saul's crown. And instead, the reward he's going to get is his own death. Why weren't you afraid to lift your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed? I was afraid to do it. I had a chance to kill King Saul in the cave in 1 Samuel 24. I had a chance to kill King Saul when the Lord put him into a deep sleep in 1 Samuel 26, and I chose not to do it because I fear God. Why weren't you afraid? Then David called one of his men, verse 15, and said, "Go, strike him down." So he struck him down and he died. For David said, "Your blood be on your own head. Your own mouth testified against you when you said, 'I killed the Lord's anointed.'" And then in verse 17, we remember that David is a musician, that David played the harp. He wrote 73 out of the 150 Psalms, and he's already written a number of them already. He wrote a lot of them when he was on the run from King Saul. He had not written any music during the time he was hiding out with the Philistines. So this is going to be the first composition that he writes since first fleeing to the Philistines in chapter 27. David took up this lament concerning Saul and his son Jonathan. Do you remember reading in the Bible about how at a funeral there would be professional singers that would come and mourn? We saw that in Mark chapter 5 when people were mourning the death of the 12-year-old girl, that Jesus rose from the dead after that. Well, they were probably singing songs of lament, songs of wailing that were written for a situation like that. Well, David writes one here. He took up this lament concerning Saul and his son Jonathan, and he ordered that the people of Judah be taught this lament of the bow. It is written in the book of Jashar. Now, the book of Jashar is lost to us, but it has some music, it has some poetry, it has some history. It's quoted a couple of times in the Bible. Just because the book of Jashar is quoted a couple of times doesn't mean that the book of Jashar is a lost book of the Bible, because the writers of the Bible were inspired by some of the literature of the time. And not all pieces of the literature of the time are holy writ, but parts of them were used as inspiration or affirmation of a point being made in the Bible. That's the most I think that we can take from that. But verse 19, David writes, "A gazelle lies slain on your heights, Israel. How the mighty have fallen. Tell it not in Gath." Remember, that's where Achish was king. "Tell it not in Gath. Proclaim it not in the streets of Ashkelon. Lest the daughters of the Philistines be glad, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised rejoice. Mountains of Gilboa, may you have neither dew nor rain. May no showers fall on your terraced fields, for there the shield of the mighty was despised, the shield of Saul no longer rubbed with oil. From the blood of the slain, from the flesh of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan did not turn back, the sword of Saul did not return unsatisfied. Saul and Jonathan, in life they were loved and admired, and in death they were not parted. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions. Daughters of Israel, weep for Saul, who clothed you in scarlet and finery, who adorn your garments with ornaments of gold. How the mighty have fallen in battle. Jonathan lies slain on your heights. I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother. You were very dear to me. Your love for me was wonderful, more wonderful than that of women. I haven't had a friendship like the one I've had with you. How the mighty have fallen. The weapons of war have perished. You see, David had no part in the death of King Saul. Now, there's going to be one or two things that make you wonder what's going on with David. Here in chapter 1, he mourns the death of Saul, and he holds an Amalekite responsible for his claim that he killed Saul in the throes of death. And in 2 Samuel chapter 4, he's going to hold the murderers of King Ishbosheth responsible for his death in chapter 4. But in chapter 3, when Joab kills Abner in peacetime, he doesn't put Joab to death because he's afraid of Joab. Joab is one of his biggest supporters, and if he alienates him, he'll lose out politically and maybe find himself endangered. So we see a complicated picture of David in the first 5 chapters of 2 Samuel. Somebody who's willing to uphold the law and put somebody to death as long as it doesn't harm him or endanger himself in any way. But when Joab does it, he lets him get away with it for a time being. So even David, a man after God's own heart, will act what is in accord with his best political interests. What he does will, in order to keep himself and his family safe. So we'll see that going forward. And it's one of the things I love about David's life is that he's so much like so many of us. He's got his good characteristics, but he's also got flaws. He's got things that he needs help with. And I think we can relate to somebody like that. Well, I hope you've enjoyed the first chapter of 2 Samuel. Jesus loves you. This I know, for the Bible tells me so. We'll be back tomorrow for 2 Samuel chapter 2. It's good to see everybody.